Hi, this is my presentation about my trip to the Titanic Museum in Belfast, Ireland. This past week was the spring break from my high school, and I was lucky enough to chaperone a field trip to Ireland, which allowed me to see a number of cultural attractions that I could have used for this project, but I decided to focus on our trip to the Titanic Museum, which was one of our first stops up in Belfast, Ireland. The museum is in Belfast because that is where the Titanic was built. So the museum stands where the Harland and Wolff shipyard used to be, Harland and Wolff being the company that made the Titanic and all of its sister ships. So it's built as both a museum to shipbuilding during that period of time as well as to the Titanic itself. It houses several exhibits that follow the history of Belfast, the construction of the ship, the design of the rooms and the interior of the ship, as well as the wreck and the aftermath and a lot of the myths associated with the Titanic. There's also a mini replica of the Titanic that is the last remaining White Star Line ship built by Harland and Wolff, and it's one of the sister ships, and it kind of gives you an idea for what it would have looked like. And here are just some pictures of what you can see. So right here and here you see the mini ship, and then they also have the dock in which the Titanic would have been housed while it was being built at its time in the shipyard. So you'll see I've added some pictures that I took from my trip in the museum. This is some of the exhibits, and this is a shaft that was built in the construction yard. We are able to take a short elevator ride up to the top part of the exhibit. So the first several exhibits focus on the history of Belfast shipmaking and the industry there. It's very interesting to learn about because Northern Ireland for a very long time was closed off to a lot of people due to the troubles in Northern Ireland. It was definitely fascinating to go up there and to get a look into some of the history of the city that a lot of tourists haven't been allowed into for the last 10, 15 years. So after you look at the history of the Belfast shipmaking industry, you take a ride through a reconstruction of what the shipyard would have looked like, and that's what this picture is from. And along the way, obviously, many primary source pictures are shown of what the shipbuilding would have looked like prior to the official launch in 1912. Now, the museum itself is built to look like both a ship and an iceberg. So at all four corners, there are 4 points that kind of give you the sense of what being at the front of a ship would have looked like. And this is one of those 4 points that I took a picture of, and it overlooks, again, that shipyard where the Titanic would have been housed while it was being built in this particular shipyard. So at this point in the museum, the exhibits detail what the Titanic would have looked like to people traveling on the ship. So you get to see a lot about the fabrics being used and the quality of the furniture. It was very interesting to learn about what the first class decks and cabins would have looked like in comparison to the second class and third class decks. You got to learn a lot of really interesting information, like the fact that all of the first class ships would have had their own private bathroom, whereas the third class people had 2 bathrooms in total for the entirety of the third class. So you definitely can see some of that change in priorities from time to time when you're looking at the way people handled things back then. So that was one of my favorite parts, looking at some of the design elements and stuff like that. Again, you saw a lot of primary source photographs, and in some places you got to touch the fabrics and see what they would have felt like in order to compare the softness of, bed sheets for the first class cabin versus the second class cabin. After looking at that, you get into the wreck of the Titanic. So this was interesting because you see the design of the museum changes a little bit. It goes from kind of light and open and airy into this really dark kind of room where you hear the Morse code messages being played over the speakers, so you can kind of get that sense of what it would have sounded like. all of the walls are painted black, with the exception of some specific pillars that are painted a really dark blue and show you what the message exchanges between the Titanic and some of the ships in the regions would have looked like. On one side of the wall, you also see a video diagram of all of the sinking and the way that the ship sunk and why it broke into two, and a lot of the mechanics of that. And this particular part of the exhibit is dedicated specifically to the sinking. So it has a lot of detail of the SOS messages being sent out and why the ship sank. I was definitely interested to learn that there was only about 25 or 30 seconds between the time the iceberg was spotted and the actual collision with the iceberg. So, I think at times maybe you have this sense that they could have done something to avert that disaster, but due to the conditions outside, they really couldn't have. It was so foggy and so hard to see that essentially the second they saw the iceberg, it was kind of all over. So that was very interesting and kind of cool how the design of the museum took you from light and open and kind of fanciful looking at these fabrics into this kind of dark, scary place with the Morse code being played overhead and kind of give you the sense of dread that you would assume people would have felt. After that, you get into a lot of the aftermath. The final exhibits detail things like accounts from survivors, the investigation that took place into why the ship sank when it was supposed to be considered unsinkable, and why so many people died and so few were rescued. So here you get to see a lot of very interesting things. So first you get to see firsthand accounts of newspaper articles that were written and things like that. You also can hear, when you press specific buttons in the museum, recordings of conversations that were had, so interviews that were had, or conversations in the investigation, so interviews with ship workers and survivors and things like that. So it was certainly sad to read about that, but also interesting to see the path that the investigation took into understanding why the Titanic sank and some of the changes that were made into shipbuilding as a result of this particular wreckage. And then finally, after you get through sort of the couple of years following the Titanic, you get to see what the Titanic looks like today. So there is a kind of video experience that shows you one of the diving ships that they have going down and exploring the wreckage of the Titanic and showing you a lot of what is there today from as many different angles as they can. So that was also interesting. It took on a whole other life in terms of exploration of marine life and biology and oceanography and some of those pieces. So very different from the rest of the museum that really focused on the era of the early 20th century and Belfast and the ship and the wreck and things like that. So it kind of brought it into the modern atmosphere. So just a couple of thoughts and comments about the overall experience. Before going to the Titanic Museum, I definitely wasn't certain how I would feel about an entire museum dedicated to one ship and one wreck. In my head, I kind of thought maybe it should be a museum to many different shipwrecks and things like that. But after finishing, I can definitely say I enjoyed my visit. There was a lot of interactive pieces. Being able to touch the fabrics and listen to the recordings and see the videos that they had playing that made it kind of interesting. I thought the way that the museum was designed, going from, happy and optimistic and excited about the future with the building of the ship into this kind of dark, scary place for the wreckage and then into the more modern era of ocean exploration and oceanography, was really well done. So I certainly would recommend going to check out the Titanic Museum if you ever find yourself in Belfast, Ireland. It's one of the many really interesting cultural attractions there. It was definitely hard to pick which cultural attraction to focus on in Belfast, Ireland. As a social studies teacher, I also absolutely loved learning about the troubles between the Catholics and the Protestants that are still kind of there today. So it's just, like I said, one of many really neat things to go visit there. So I just want to leave you with this picture outside of the Titanic Museum. It is all 30 students that were on the trip with us that we were fortunate to take, as well as myself. So the museum is here in the background. You can kind of see the pointed edge that I was talking about earlier, that makes you feel like you're maybe on the bow of the ship. And then these are all the students, and that's me right there, kind of really little. Um, so it was a really great way to spend a spring break. Definitely exciting that I got to do my cultural experience project on a place totally different and outside of the country. So I had a lot of fun doing this presentation and seeing the museum and doing everything, and I hope you have enjoyed listening. So thank you very much.